Good morning. This is Rebecca Smith Aldridge. I'm the co-chair of the New York Library Association Sustainability Initiative, and we're thrilled to have Michelle Stricker, the Deputy State Librarian for Lifelong Learning from the New Jersey State Library, join us today. We know we've got people crossing the borders here to help us with the webinar, but the New Jersey State Library has done some fabulous work in the area of disaster planning, and Michelle is a nationally recognized expert on the topic in the library profession. Michelle works on a variety of things at the State Library, but specializes in a couple of things that are very relevant to the work we're going to be doing here through the Sustainability Initiative. She specializes in trustee and director education, and she herself was formerly a small library director, which makes her a very practical advisor on many of the topics that we're faced with. Michelle has a certification in preservation management and even teaches on that topic for Rutgers University, and is the founder of the New Jersey Cultural Alliance for Response, which, thanks to her leadership, is now part of the New Jersey Emergency Support Network. So she's really led the charge in helping people understand how libraries play a critical role in disaster preparedness and response. So I'm going to stop talking because Michelle has so much good information to share with us this morning. So Michelle, take it away.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here as to present on behalf of NYLA, the Sustainability Initiative, which I think is just fabulous. And so we're going to get started. I do have a lot to cover. I think Rebecca is going to monitor the chat box for questions, and hopefully we'll have some time afterwards, 5 or 10 minutes, where I can answer your questions. So with that, I want to get started with the presentation. Where do you go when disaster strikes? Well, after Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey in late October 2012, people went to their local library. Many community libraries were pressed into service as ad hoc disaster recovery centers. And even though they may have sustained great damage to their own buildings and were without power themselves, librarians rallied and were in the forefront of providing services and information to those in need and a respite from the storm for shattered communities. Unless they were damaged by flooding, New Jersey libraries were open and were the place residents flocked to the morning after Sandy passed, using computers and free wireless to begin putting their lives back together, to conduct business, to work from home, to contact relatives or their insurance companies, to fill out FEMA forms, or just to power up their devices and warm up because it was an extremely cold November. Libraries truly serve their communities as ports in a storm, even though many of them were not prepared to serve in this capacity as unofficial community disaster recovery centers. Because of this, the New Jersey State Library organized a statewide summit that we called Ports in a Storm, and it was the first conference presented to help libraries prepare to be even greater partners in community disaster response and recovery when the next emergency strikes. We partnered with the National Network Libraries of Medicine, their Middle Atlantic region, on the conference, and that was attended by 125 librarians, including representatives from New York, Delaware, and Virginia. The goal of the summit was to bring medical and public librarians together, along with the emergency planning community, first responders, public health workers, and faith-based groups, and provide a forum for discussing the roles libraries and information professionals play in supporting future disaster preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. This same scenario has been repeated many times now and in many states, whether it's a natural disaster like hurricanes, floods, mudslides, fire, or man-made disasters such as chemical spills, train wrecks, or civil unrest like shootings that are in the library or even the current opioid epidemic. And I know this is the reason why most of you are listening in today. So therefore, my goal is to promote the role of libraries as partners in disaster response and give you some tools so that you can start to think about what to do in your own facilities and community. I'm going to tell you about some of our libraries after Superstorm Sandy to demonstrate how libraries are assets in a disaster and to give you some ideas on what you could do in your very own community. And I'll show you all of the resources we've made available for your use. We talk a little about preparing your facility for disaster, but I will mostly focus on the library's role in the community after a disaster. And that means your partnerships with elected officials, emergency responders, and other local groups active after a disaster. The photo that you see is an actual photo from one of our libraries after Sandy, and according to the Red Cross, the #1 emergency call that was made during Sandy were from people who needed to plug things in to stay alive, such as the ventilator, CPAP, oxygen. So let's see. My screen is not advancing here. So Rebecca, I'm wondering why my screen is not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. So first I want to call your attention to the Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. This is a federal law designed to bring federal, national, natural disaster assistance for state and local governments in carrying out their responsibilities to aid citizens. Section 403 of the Stafford Act has changed, or was changed several years ago, so that libraries are now designated as essential services and are therefore eligible for temporary relocation funding during major disasters and emergencies under the FEMA Public Assistance Program. So prior to this, FEMA's list included facilities for police, fire, emergency services, medical care, education, utilities, and other essential community services, but not libraries. Libraries are vital information hubs, and in the aftermath of a disaster can take on an even greater community role, providing free and easy access to technology and essential information. And so we're very happy that FEMA recognized our contributions and made this important change to the Stafford Act. So libraries should prepare and embrace their roles as community disaster recovery centers and telecommunications information hubs before and after an emergency. And we here are challenging libraries to assume this role. And I want to be clear about what I mean by a disaster recovery center. We know that libraries are not official DRCs that are pre-qualified ahead of time by FEMA. Lakeville Public Library you see on the screen, they were pre-certified ahead of time, but our Caldwell Public Library on the left was not pre-certified. We realize that not every library can serve as an official disaster recovery center because they're very expensive to set up and staff. And FEMA simply does not have the resources to do this, to set up and staff every library after an emergency. But libraries have served as unofficial DRCs through many a storm, and librarians have worked alongside of FEMA and emergency responders, supporting their services and providing assistance after Sandy and other natural and man-made disasters. It's a natural role that libraries assume in the community. Hurricane Sandy in October 2012 was a reminder to New Jersey municipal, county, and state officials that libraries are valuable, proven assets in disaster response and serve as a rallying point for the community in an emergency. After a disaster, libraries serve multiple roles. They act as a safe haven, as disaster recovery centers, unofficial, as I mentioned, as information hub, and as headquarters for volunteer organizations. They're a natural gathering place for people after a disaster because of the multiple roles they assume. Libraries are located pretty much in every community. I know they are here in New Jersey. We have over 400 library buildings in this state. And the locations of the libraries are known, and most importantly, our services are trusted by all in the municipal towns and even by the non-users. And, by the way, I just think that this is like a terrific drawing that somebody had turned into the library after Sandy. After a disaster, libraries offer respite from the storm. They are a welcoming refuge for displaced citizens for many reasons. Libraries, for the most part, have safe and secure buildings. They have relaxing, comfortable seating and flexible spaces. They have heat and air conditioning, and they have restroom facilities. They serve as a communication and information hub for the community with well-equipped tech labs because they have internet, free Wi-Fi, email, fax, photocopiers, and let's not forget, landlines are still very important. And they serve as a general gathering place for information updates for the community and have been used as a temporary headquarters for FEMA, for government agencies, for relief workers, and even the military here in New Jersey. They serve as distribution center for relief agencies, for food and coat drives. And all of these are assets, you know, and when you think about what your contribution is going to be, you don't have to do all of these, but all of these assets help restore a sense of normalcy to the community, a sense of routine for adults and children amidst the chaos of a disaster. Libraries help people and small business get back to work and back on their feet after a disaster. And that's what is known as community resiliency. Now, libraries have always provided these services to their community, but in an emergency, they are truly ports in a storm. Embracing this role is another way that libraries continue to evolve and to meet needs of the community and are valued as an essential community service. So let's talk about librarians. At our Ports in the Storm conference, the Red Cross representatives told us that a critical need after disaster is the need for accurate information, and that's exactly what librarians are trained to provide. Our skill set is such that we are great with technology, pretty much, right? We deliver accurate information in a variety of formats and settings, and we're pretty good at strategizing and problem solving quickly. Furthermore, the public sees librarians as more approachable than government agency staff. And according to a 2011 Knight Foundation poll and a Gallup poll, so there are two different polls, the public trusts us more than the news media. So that's 78% to librarians to only 33% to the news media. And among 18 and 35-year-olds, that shoots up to 87% trust in librarians. So librarians are viewed as knowledgeable, they're trusted in the community, they're helpful, and highly approachable. Customer service oriented, and people know we help them find information without judging their motives. Even our paraprofessional and support staff is dedicated, and many know their customers very well because many live in the communities themselves. So our staffs are really the best resources we offer to the community and to emergency management in the aftermath of a disaster. I want to stress that librarians serve in the capacity really of second responders who support first responders. We're not asking librarians to rush in alongside of emergency personnel. That would not be helpful. However, we are information first responders. And yes, I actually had those very cool pins made, which I hand out to my in-person trainings. So the objective of a second responder is to quickly enable people to get back to work, back to their lives, and ensure recovery of a community's economic life. Identifying and empowering second responders helps make the difference between a lasting disruption from the disaster and a quick return to daily life. And libraries play a critical role in making this happen. Furthermore, libraries continue to play a role long after the disaster is, say, over, and a role in the community really extends much longer than any other organizations. Emergency management is going to withdraw once the emergency is over. Government agencies are going to pack their bags up afterwards once all the forms are filled out and the aid is distributed. But libraries have staying power in the community. And in New Jersey, we are still assisting people affected by Sandy more than 5 years out. So here are a couple of examples of how libraries that were in the direct path of Sandy actively served as disaster recovery centers. And hopefully this will give you some ideas about how you can partner with the libraries in your own town. And remember that your response is scalable. There's always something that you can do, no matter how big and small you are. So if you look on the left side with the yellow tents, that is the Neptune Public Library, and they are right on the coastline there, sort of in central Jersey. And they had plenty of warning that this hurricane was coming. So before the storm, the mayor told the library staff to pack a bag and be ready for, to stay for 72 hours and report to work. And so the library staff they prepared their facility for the aftermath of the storm. What they did at their facility was they added extra extension cords and power strips to meet the demands of the public. They suspended all library fines and fees because, you're not going to deal with the stress of that in the aftermath when, you've lost everything. They moved furniture around to accommodate crowds and the power users that were going to come in to, power up their devices. They were prepared, and they did help enter FEMA data into spreadsheets. They documented townwide street closures afterwards. They worked with the high school transportation center, and they helped man the phones at City Hall like 24/7, for the first week. And offsite, and that's where you see the tents that were put up. Offsite, the mayor requested the loan of the library's laptops and their outreach and reference librarians to staff this sort of portable lab that they had here. So the librarians brought their computers and their power cables and their power strips to the part of town that had the worst damage. No cars could get there. You could only walk there. An emergency management truck was moved in as a mobile command center, and that provided power and a Wi-Fi node for internet access, and Public Works brought in tables, propane heaters, and porta-johns. And so the Neptune Public Libraries, they manned the emergency management tent and helped with FEMA applications for 5 days after Sandy hit. They input applications right there at the scene, and that's what you see them doing. And residents from all around town walked, as I said, they walked to these tents because the roads were impassable. Neptune figured that they helped at least 150 residents just in those few days. So on the right, you'll see slides from the Ocean County Library, and they are our largest county library system in the state. They have 22 branches, and mostly, again, central Jersey where the storm hit, and mostly all along the coastline. So they were really the hardest hit, not only their towns, but the county library system. The libraries, they lost 2 of their branches, 2 of their 22 branches, and that they've since reopened with major renovations. But other branches had severe flooding and were without power for quite a while. But even with all their facilities problems, they tried to get as many branches open as possible the next day. Now, they were bigger library systems, so they already had a standby generator, but that only powered their network, nothing else. And so their headquarters library, their biggest library in Toms River, had no power. All right, but even so, with no power, their local municipal Office of Emergency Management used their main branch as their headquarters, and the library ran food and coat drives out of the main building. And they also had pre-set up their website as sort of a hurricane resource information site. So you went straight, if you went to their homepage, your homepage was nothing but resources for getting help after the storm. And they also, if you look at that bottom right-hand slide, in the midst of all of this, they held a 2-day information fair in 2 locations, 2 branches, where they brought together all their community offices and volunteer groups in one place so that their residents didn't have to go all over the place to search for the information they needed. The East Brunswick Public Library, they're sort of central but a little bit inland. They were also affected, and they called themselves Ground Zero for the community. They were without power for days. Even so, they were still open to the public during the day, and then they would have to shut down when it got dark. And this is the end of October, so it did get dark rather early, 5, 6 o'clock at night at that point. They knew Sandy was coming, so before it hit, they prepared additional electronic and also paper resources at their reference center. And that included information on general health, on mental health first aid, and they had a special section of resources for pregnant women that might need special help. The mayor of East Brunswick, the town officials, and their director of emergency management, and the police all relied on the library to help get out critical information through their website and especially through social media. So the reference librarians tweeted constant updates on where to get gas, who had power, advisories and warnings such as which roads to stay off because there were down wires, where people could get food, the location of warming stations, and where there was hot water so people could, get a shower. Previously, they had moved everything to the cloud so that their website would never be down, even if they did lose power, which they did for a few days. And they felt that people need immediate access to this accurate, vetted information, and that's exactly what East Brunswick worked to provide, and they continue to work to provide that to their customers. So I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about first things first, preparing your library facility to be resilient. So, of course, the whole point of this initiative is to promote cooperation and coordination among emergency management and community partners in the library. And this is really, over the last few years, it was a whole community approach to disaster response for libraries that focused on service continuity and community resiliency. This is something we didn't learn about in library school. So in fact, I've recently seen a number of presentations from academic librarians reporting and writing articles on the role that libraries could play after a disaster. But really, if they had checked out with the public libraries in the field, they would find out, like across the country, really how much of this is already going on. So this is nothing new for the people who have the boots on the ground, the public libraries. Our first responders have always been involved with disaster preparedness and response and recovery. That's their job. And it's only been in the last few years that libraries have begun to access their post-disaster resources and services and plan how to work more closely with the community. It's all about the resources that we have to offer them. So here's a short list on how we will advise libraries to prepare for an emergency ahead of time, so that you're prepared to assume the role of a community disaster recovery center. So number one, prepare your library facility and staff. This means the library must have a disaster plan, an emergency technology plan, a service continuity plan, and a temporary facilities plan. Bring in your power supplies, your portable generator, your power strips now. Don't stock up on any laptops and computers, because maybe by the time you actually have an emergency, they're going to be obsolete. So what we say is have a little bit of a fund set up of a few $1,000s, if you can, to go out and buy, a few laptops if your tech lab gets completely wiped out. So what's new about this is the focus on service continuity instead of sort of the traditional disaster plan, and which is internal. Okay, we're taking the business model of continuity of service and we're applying it to public libraries. So number two, prepare and promote your online resources ahead of time. Move everything to the cloud. You can't do that once an emergency hits. Three, form a regional emergency response network. Partner with other libraries for support services and to share a cache of disaster supplies. Four, inform elected officials of the services that you intend to offer after a disaster, because they really don't know what you have to offer. And also keep in contact with them during and after the disaster so that you're able to give the updates that they need. They need you to get out. Number five, learn the incident command system and the management structure of emergency response. Librarians need to understand the special language of emergency response and to follow their orders and their advice. And so you could take this online. I'll talk more about that later on. And then number six, work with other community partners. You want to find and join forces with others in your community whose mission includes disaster response, like those faith-based and nonprofit groups. Number 7, we encourage libraries to take part in National Preparedness Month that's sponsored by FEMA. This happens every September, and to offer programming throughout the year that will help the community get ready for emergencies. Promote the role of the library as a disaster recovery center. An educated community is a safer community, a community that is resilient and therefore bounces back faster. And number 8, be familiar with salvaging family treasures materials. You can just Google that online and know that once the disaster hits and afterwards and people begin cleaning up their lives, the first thing that they're going to want to salvage are their own family treasures, those photographs, the pictures, the mementos of their loved ones. And that's where sometimes paper comes in handy with those kind of instructions. So talking about writing a disaster plan, forget about those big fat disaster plans that sit on the shelf. The ones I'm talking about, they're 100 pages long. This is the only one you need, this pocket disaster response plan. This is the one tool that all members of your staff should have on them at all times for emergencies. So it's called the PREP plan, and it was originally developed by the Council of State Archivists. It's a two-sided document that actually folds up to the sides of a credit card, making it easy to fit in a wallet or your purse for maximum portability and convenience. One side is going to feature a list of emergency contacts, and the other a floor plan of your library and a list of information categories. So you can just go to this link and download the document, and you should feel free to modify it however you want. I put up some beneficial, information categories, and you'll see 12 of them listed here. You don't have to have all of those categories. This is totally customizable. It's totally up to you what you feel is important to include for your library. I also have up on the New Jersey State Library's website under disaster preparedness, we already have a modified version of this prep plan for libraries. So you can also go there, and hopefully that might be a little bit more beneficial to you. You won't have to do as much editing. You then have to join forces with regional emergency or create regional emergency response networks. This is really for your facilities and your collections help. Okay, you want to build a cache of disaster supplies and a network of people that work in libraries that are going to help you with salvage, because let's face it, you're not going to be able to really help people in your communities if you're not able to take care of your facilities first, clean up the mess, get yourself opened up. Okay, and that's exactly what you see here in the upper left. You'll see some of the supplies that one of the libraries has stored on site, and then we did some practice salvage drills with materials. And Rebecca had mentioned our New Jersey Alliance for Response, and this is the kind of trainings that we do in the state on that. So then we created here at the State Library the Librarians Disaster Preparedness and Community Resiliency Toolkit. And there's the link for that. It's a two-part document, and what I wanted was for it to be really easily accessible. There's a guidebook and there's a workbook, and it's all free for you to download. We have a PowerPoint presentation about the toolkit, and we also have an archived webinar about using the toolkit. And this is really, I think, a unique resource, and we've shared it with many, many states. It was developed along with, I worked with a consultant from the emergency management community in creating this. It was really, like I said, I wanted it to be simple to use. I wanted it to be like in a checklist format that focused on really the services and the resources that you will develop and offer your community after a disaster. So this is really different from your straightforward disaster plan. Remember, I said that's internal. This is a toolkit that concerns people and the community, not your facilities, not your collections. And that's what really makes it unique. Oops. So here you just see it's very plain and unadored. You'll see the guidebook, which is going to tell you how to fill up the workbook. Again, that's available PDF and in a Word doc on the State Library's website. And I know that you can't read these, the small print very well, but I just kind of wanted you to see the headlines on some of the pages. So making the most of the toolkit. You'll see checklist of community resiliency services, and that's going to include your on-site services like charging stations, lending material, starting to lend materials again, resuming programs, acting as a town's information hub. It's also going to review your outreach services. Do you have any bookmobiles you're able to, go out into the field? Your social media outreach, medical alerts that you might have to put out, and also donations. Can you coordinate that, or can you tell people where there's going to be donations, a drop-off points for that? And then there's a whole bunch of additional worksheets. There'll be a security checklist you have to go through, dealing with disruptive people that are in a crisis, how to deal with that. There's a hazard list checklist that are, and in the back it's identified by state. There's shelter in place information, notices. There's a crisis communications plan that you can create. And there's also a list of notification signals for people with disabilities. So you see, we really tried to cover, everything. And these are typically not things that, a library or the library staff is going to think of after a disaster. So we've been talking about the resources that libraries bring to emergency management after a disaster. Although they may not always be aware, we've been, that libraries bring to emergency management after a disaster, although emergency management may not always be aware of the important role that libraries do play in community resiliency. So you, the library, must approach them yourselves and tell them about what you have to offer them. Ask if you can join their conversations about risk assessment, mitigation, and preparedness planning in your area of coverage. Ask to be incorporated into your county, state, and local preparedness exercise scenarios and action plans. Start by establishing a primary point of contact at the local emergency management office in your town. Request a seat at the table, at their planning meetings, at their briefings, and at their updates. And realize that this is a partnership between the library and emergency management that must be sustained, that training, outreach, and communication is an ongoing process. You have to make emergency management realize the importance of getting your library open again quickly after a disaster. Because remember, FEMA considers the library to be an essential service. They can help you by restoring power quickly, clearing debris, and doing some minor repairs around the library facility. And it's necessary that you remain high on their priority list so that you can open to provide the services to the community that they need. So plan to work together on this. Now, funding is not needed, or it's very, very minimal, and it should not be an obstacle in your partnership effort with emergency management. If it's a regional or statewide partnership effort, then the only thing you really have to think about is travel, and what is required of some of your staff for meetings. I mentioned the infinite command system earlier, and I hope I've driven home the point that really it's your responsibility to contact emergency management. So yes, it's all on you to establish and nurture these relationships. They are so busy with so many other things that they're not going to reach out to you. I mentioned earlier that they have their own default language called the incident command system when disaster strikes. And the beauty really of this system is that it's scalable. It's applicable to a small or large area incident. And notice, I'm calling it an incident, which is their word for disaster. They don't use that word. And all emergency responders are going to understand it, and they're going to fall into it after a disaster strikes, as they're instructed to do. So I highly recommend that you at least become familiar with the terminology. And then you're going to know who's going to be the incident commander. You'll see the scale up there, who's going to be the safety officer, the public information officer. These are all designated responsibilities. once you really become a little bit familiar with it, you can see how valuable it really is to keep things calm and coordinated after a disaster. And you can even implement it to some degree in your own library. Who's going to be your own incident commander? Who's going to be the public information officer, the only person that is going to talk with the media? You know, because you only want one of those. You don't want different stories going out, obviously, and so on. So it's very interesting, and there's the link that you could take your own training. Whoops. The Red Cross really is desperate for volunteers after a disaster. But in order to volunteer, you have to be trained or they really can't use you. And that's why we recommend that your library disaster response team, this is not going to be everybody in your library, but you can assign a team, receive what's called CERT training. And they usually do this locally. You can check with your local emergency management person to see when and where and how often they offer it. So we really want you to get trained. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to use you to help your community after an emergency. So the New Jersey State Library is now involved with a new statewide initiative that involves it's called NJ VOADs. The VOADs are Volunteers Active After Disasters. And this is actually a state-run bureau that's part of the office, under the Office of Emergency Management State Operations Plan, their official plan. And they have asked the New Jersey State Library and that libraries, and we would be the primary contact, become a formal part of this plan by serving as walk-in volunteer registration centers. So given the role that libraries played in the state after Sandy, they thought that libraries would be an ideal partner. And we've done a lot of work to raise our profile to do just that. So therefore, the New Jersey State Library is now a formal part of what's called ESF 15. That's the Emergency Support Function 15, and that is Emergency Support Services. So after a disaster, we do have a seat at the table with them, and our job is going to be to contact libraries in affected areas to see, what they're doing, what they're capable of doing, and to be ready to step in and help people register with the Red Cross to become active volunteers and help clean up after an emergency. So here's another training corps you should locate and get to know. Citizen Corps. And these are the people that are going to come into your library and, clean out the mud. And they're willing to help with the dirty work. You can see them doing that right here. And if they are working out in the community and you see them around, you might want to even offer them a place to meet, coffee and snacks, places to warm up, because, really, they're really working hard and they're willing to roll up their sleeves and get right down in the mess to help you clean up. And then search out those faith-based groups and nonprofits that are active after a disaster. The United Methodist Church is one very, very big, actually worldwide organization that does that. Offer them space in the library for food and clothing drives. And this is how you build this whole community support team in times of great need. And I've been reading a little bit, it's been very interesting, about what's called asset-based community development. It's called a place-based framework that builds on the skills and experiences and knowledge and passions of the local residents and local associations that helps you build a more sustainable community. And that's a community that's going to be more resilient, that relies on itself, okay? That's what resiliency is in the community. You're going to rely on yourself and help yourself out rather than waiting for somebody to come in and save you from the outside, some government agency to come in, because you know what? It's just not going to happen. Let me take a few minutes to talk about one of our great strengths, and that is social media and technology. Social media has proven to be very adept at covering disasters. So when Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, people went to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to post and share images of the storm. That people used social media to connect, to share, to collaborate their disaster recovery efforts. Local folks also used social media to keep up with news reports and even made use of mapping sites to keep track of, what gas stations were open and where the food and supply distribution centers were. Thousands and thousands of photos of storm damages were posted to Flickr. So social media is now considered so vital after a disaster that it's incorporated into all emergency preparedness and communications efforts because the public is expecting it and the public is using it, and they are not going to be waiting to be told what to do, but they're actively posting what they know and seeking out what they don't know. Websites and email and even paper resources will continue to be important for the public, but in times of a crisis and the resulting communication noise all around them, librarians are going to need to push out urgent messages directly onto social media, into the social media world, and then direct the public back to their more comprehensive online resources. So this is a technology I think that's particularly well suited to librarians and to information professionals because, we're usually adept at with vetted news sources and technology. And this is truly where we can claim the mantle of information first responders. Here's a partnership that I think is ideally suited to emergency management and information professionals. And you can check to see if your state already has a virtual operations support team. I know that we do. Or you can talk to your local emergency management about implementing a VOS team for yourself and locally. Remember I gave you that example of East Brunswick Public Library where they were tweeting out information for their mayor and for a local emergency management? So that's exactly what I'm talking about. VOST makes use of social media tools to help those on the ground who would otherwise be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data generated during a disaster. It's an effective way of using social media during a disaster to make it easier for emergency managers to handle the massive amount of information being generated in a crisis, while also meeting the expectations of the people demanding that information. So an increasing number of emergency managers use social media to share updates and information, but really they have very few staff resources or the time to keep up with that constant and overwhelming flow of information during a disaster, and much of it can be totally wrong. So even small local disasters can stretch the resources of a small emergency management team, leaving the public with unanswered questions or incorrect information from unofficial sources. And so VOST really is perfect for the librarian skill set. Investigate partnering with your local municipality to establish a VOST team in your own region. And then I just want to throw in one more idea here because I think it's great and I think librarians could be very helpful after a disaster. And that's with this idea of targeted community giving. So this is actually an Amazon site that's set up like a bridal registry, only you can see it was for, Hurricane Sandy. And the idea is to get the community the kinds of things it really needs after a disaster, besides money, which is actually really the best thing that people should contribute. But a lot of people, they don't like doing that, and they want to feel like they're actually donating something. Unwanted donations are often called the disaster after the disaster, and most often they're no help whatsoever. In fact, they can actually be detrimental to the rescue process because emergency responders and volunteers often have to get rid of all that unwanted junk that people have donated. They have to get it out of the way before they can actually get in to get to the people, to get the supplies, including medical supplies that they really need. So this is something that you can investigate on your own, setting up like an online, bridal registry on Amazon. I think it's still up there, so if you want to peruse it and see the kind of things people ask for, I see the one thing that's right here. It's like heated max hot hand warmers, 40 pair. And there's lots of great things up there. I'll give you some ideas of the things that are needed after a disaster. So let's review, I guess, some of the things we talked about today and the steps that you can take to help your community after disaster. Put together a committee to write a disaster plan. Use that prep template I showed you. You'll be done in an afternoon if you use it. And if you want to advance from there, FEMA has a number of disaster practice scenarios on their website, and you're highly encouraged to do at least one of those a year, a practice, what you would do with your staff in the event of emergency, a tabletop exercise. So FEMA has those on their website. Plan for the reopening of your facilities so that you can help your community. And of course, if your building is severely damaged, like those in Texas during Hurricane Harvey, this may be totally impossible. If your building's washed away or underwater, it's totally impossible to get reopened and to help. People need to help you. But use the Resiliency Toolkit that's on the State Library's website, and that's available for free. Investigate how you would resume some of your critical operations, maybe in another location, off-site. Identify and contact your regional response network, that's going to help you in the event of emergency. These are people either in the area or they can be, or other libraries that are out of the area that can help you get together or help you with your building itself or with your materials that have been damaged. Establish your community connections before a disaster strikes and maintain those connections so that they don't forget about you. Okay, it's very easy. You're going to go tell them, they're going to forget in a year. So with emergency management and elected officials, make sure you tell them what resources you have and that you're going to bring to the table and how you are going to help them after disaster. Learn that incident command system so that you can speak their language. And now make contact with your local community volunteers, those who are on the CERT teams and Citizen Corps, the local faith-based and nonprofit groups, and get CERT trained yourself. Let the community know to check your Facebook page and your Twitter account after an emergency. You'll be keeping those up to date with alerts from local officials and emergency management. And you can put together your own social media team for this. Remember, the thing about social media is you want to direct people back to your website and online resources. The social media team, they're often called the pajama brigade because you don't actually need to be on site to do this. You could do this from your home. And then finally know that the day after disaster, the public will be at your door. They're going to be at your door just like they were the day after Sandy to all the libraries in our state. So be as ready for them as you can. Think about the ways to make your spaces flexible to accommodate the crowds. And then one further word of advice: your staff may be personally affected by a disaster, and they need permission from their directors, from their trustees, or whoever their superiors are. They need permission to take care of themselves and their families first. And also, there's people on your staff who are not going to do well in an emergency situation. There's people that are good in a crisis, and there are people who are not. So you're going to have to consider your staff's own mental health before helping them and asking them to deal with the community in distress. And I'll give you one example. We had a library director, and she asked that her name is never given or her library. But like I said, it was in October. Things got dark. It got dark early at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. She had her library open and there was no power. And then come the end of the night, the Sandy really affected businesses and homes. But the libraries themselves may have been without power, but primarily the buildings were secure and safe. But because they had no power, people had to leave when it got dark, and people would not leave her facility. So she had to call in, the police. And this caused her no end of distress to see people who had absolutely nowhere to go. And it was a terrible situation for her. So you have to take to heart and to in consideration your staff's own mental health, and they need their own mental health first aid to take care of themselves. Because in the end, really, all disaster response is local. Your local library can be a port in the storm when needed most, but can be a true lifesaver when all of you work together to offer a wealth of coordinated services to a community in need. So I hope this short presentation has helped you see libraries in a new light and has given you a few concrete steps on how to prepare your library for a future disaster. You don't have to do all of the things, remember, but you can do what you can. You owe it to your community to do as much as you can, to open up if you can, to help them. Remember, they are counting on you. They're counting on your help. So thank you for listening, and that's the end of the presentation, and I think we have about 10 minutes to spare. And so I'm hoping Rebecca was monitoring chat if there was any, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have at this point.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was fantastic. I think you packed so much into a short period of time that was useful, and so much stuff to explore and to figure out in our own local communities, whether that be in a town or city or county, if not statewide, for us to consider. So thank you for your expertise and for laying it out so logically and just like a librarian would. We really appreciate that. And yeah, there were some questions that came up while you were talking.
Okay.
The first question here, someone would like to know more about the Salvaging Family Treasures program that you mentioned earlier.
Okay, well, that was actually an IMLS program that was called Connecting to Collections, and there was this was let me see, maybe around 2008, 9, and 10. So if you just Google Saving America's Treasures or Salvaging Family Treasures, Connecting to Collections, you're going to find a number of materials that are available that are going to tell you how you can help the public, when they start coming in and, wanting you to help salvage their photographs and scrapbooks and things like that. And also, I have a fairly extensive preservation a website on the state library site that also has those salvaging family treasures. So libraries, what they did, a lot of them, what they did in the aftermath, was they would take people's materials, and this is really helpful if you have a lot of space, and sometimes you can coordinate this with your local school that has a big cafeteria, and you just will help people. It gives you step-by-step what to do, how you help to fan out the material so that they can dry without getting mold. And it gets to be kind of complicated. You really, this gets into the area of preservation. So you really don't want to, be taking too much of this, on your own unless you are trained as a conservator. But the Salvaging Family Treasures does give you some simple steps that you can do when people come and they want help, and when their photographs are wet, and their papers are wet. There's a really great presentation by National Network Libraries of Medicine called Unpacking Your Digital Go Bag. So that's about, tells you about getting all your important documents on flash drive that you can keep with you, and so hopefully you'll be able to find that information on my website or under Connecting to Collections.
That's awesome. That's a whole nother webinar, I think, just to talk about that.
Yep, it is.
So I want to give everyone a few more minutes if there was other questions to come through. I noticed that Bar Madonna is on the line, who's the director up at Gloversville, and she summed it up so well. It's lots of work, but for an important purpose. And this webinar has made it much less scary that we know the steps now. So one of the things we wanted to share with everyone is that we'll send out the link to Michelle's website on the New York State Library's webpage extensive resources that she shared here today, including the guidebook and workbook that were developed in New Jersey with that emergency services consultant that Michelle mentioned. And I see here in the comment box, someone mentioned that the American Library Association has also put together some good resources after Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So that's pretty cool to know that there's tons of stuff out there for us to oh, I see they've actually pasted them all into the box. That's pretty cool. Yeah. So we'll gather all that stuff that's been mentioned and noted here today and make sure that's accessible through the New York Library Association Sustainability Initiative. This webinar will be archived, so we'll add up those resources underneath the archive version of that.
I just wanted to also mention that all the photographs that you see in the presentation were actual photographs taken from other libraries after Sandy, and 99% of the libraries were all what I would call small libraries, small town libraries. They did what they could for their community. It was almost like instinctual that they knew what they had to do. But, hopefully what we did was be able to get you not to like operate in a crisis yourself. Okay, open the door. So now somebody will run to Home Depot and get more power strips. And, hopefully the resources are going to help you prepare in advance. But these were all small libraries doing what they could do. So if they could do it, you could do it.
Michelle, I think that thing I know that you're very interested in researching and bringing to the fore about asset-based community development, I think that really fits with the same model of libraries we have here in New York that you have in New Jersey, that there's a library in almost every town. And how can we be the catalyst and convener to make sure people are prepared and know what to do and most importantly are ready to work together regardless of what incident may come their way.
You learned the term right away, Rebecca. Yeah, that asset community mapping, and you can go online again. There's a separate toolkit for that. I saw a presentation on that not too long ago, and it totally changed my way of thinking about community resiliency and about using the gifts, they call them the gifts, of the people and organizations in your community and getting the people to help themselves, because that's really, that's really what makes a community resilient, and not waiting. A lot of people are going to wait for somebody to come to help them. And you've got to get them and yourselves out of that mentality, that way of thinking. So I'm hoping to explore that more in the future.
I think we will too. So Michelle, I'm high-fiving you virtually. This was fantastic, right. And I think exactly what people were hoping for. And you've given us very practical advice and resources to follow up with. So thank you very much for your time. I'll just note for everyone, Michelle donated her time today, as do all the members of the New York Library Association Sustainability Initiative Committee. We've got 25 members who volunteer their time, hoping to help libraries build better communities throughout New York and beyond. So thank you, everyone. And Michelle, thank you again. Awesome job.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.